Staff Sergeant Rachel Morrison had always believed that the worst wounds she'd treat in combat would belong to someone else. She was wrong. When the shrapnel tore through her abdomen during the firefight in Kandahar province, she had exactly 47 minutes before the evacuation helicopter could reach their position. 47 minutes to keep herself alive while enemy bullets shattered the concrete around her makeshift field hospital. What happened next would redefine everything the military knew about combat medicine under fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th started like any other at Forward Operating Base Viper in Afghanistan's volatile eastern region. Rachel Morrison finished her third cup of coffee before dawn, checking her medical supplies with the methodical precision that had kept dozens of soldiers alive over her 18-month deployment. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen enough battlefield trauma to fill several lifetimes, yet still possessed the steady hands that made her one of the most requested combat medics in the 82nd Airborne Division. The mission briefing at 600 hours was routine, a patrol to the village of Kalat Bazar, where intelligence suggested Taliban forces were using civilian buildings to store weapons. Rachel's role would be standard: accompany Bravo Company, establish a casualty collection point, and provide immediate medical support if things went sideways. She strapped on her 60-pound medical kit, adjusted her helmet, and joined the convoy of 4 armored vehicles heading into the dusty mountains. Captain James Hendricks, the company commander, had specifically requested Rachel for this operation. 3 weeks earlier, she had saved 2 of his men during an IED attack, working for 20 minutes under sporadic sniper fire to stabilize a soldier whose femoral artery had been severed by flying debris. Her reputation for remaining calm under extreme pressure had spread throughout the forward operating base, earning her the nickname Ice Queen among the troops, a title she wore with quiet pride. The convoy reached the village outskirts at 9:30 hours. Kalat Bazar clung to the mountainside like a collection of mud brick boxes, connected by narrow alleyways that twisted between ancient walls. The villagers watched from doorways and windows as the American soldiers established their perimeter, their faces revealing nothing about potential dangers lurking in the shadows. Rachel set up her aid station in a partially collapsed building that offered both protection and quick access to the main road where evacuation vehicles could reach wounded personnel. For the first 2 hours, the operation proceeded without incident. The soldiers moved methodically through the village, searching compounds and questioning locals through interpreters. Rachel treated minor injuries: a soldier who had scraped his arm on razor wire, another who was showing early signs of heat exhaustion in the climbing temperature. She restocked her IV supplies, checked her radio communications with the base, and allowed herself to believe this might be one of the quiet days. The first mortar round struck at 11:47 hours. Rachel was bandaging Private Collins's scraped knuckles when the explosion shattered the morning calm. The blast originated from somewhere beyond the village's eastern edge, sending a shower of dirt and pebbles raining down on the American positions. Within seconds, her radio crackled with urgent voices as soldiers throughout the village reported incoming fire from multiple directions. "Contact! Contact! We've got RPGs coming from the mosque. Snipers fire from the rooftops, need immediate suppression. Bravo 2 is pinned down behind the market stalls." Rachel grabbed her aid bag and sprinted toward the sound of gunfire, her training overriding any instinct for self-preservation. The narrow alleyways had become death traps, with enemy fighters using the maze-like layout to attack from unexpected angles before disappearing into the labyrinth of interconnected buildings. She reached the first casualty within 3 minutes, Sergeant Rodriguez, who had taken a bullet through his shoulder while trying to reach better cover. Working with practiced efficiency, Rachel applied pressure to the wound, started an IV line, and administered pain medication while bullets whined overhead. Rodriguez was conscious and stable, but he needed immediate evacuation to prevent further blood loss. She called for stretcher bearers over her radio, then moved on to the next wounded soldier 50 meters away. The battle intensified as Taliban reinforcements arrived from the surrounding mountains. What had begun as a routine patrol was rapidly evolving into a major engagement, with enemy fighters demonstrating a level of coordination and firepower that suggested careful planning. Rachel moved between casualties, her medical bag growing lighter as she used supplies faster than she had anticipated. Each wounded soldier required precious minutes of treatment time, and the evacuation helicopter was still 40 minutes out due to mechanical problems at the main base. By noon, she had treated 8 casualties, ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to a complex leg fracture that required immediate surgery. The abandoned building she had chosen for her aid station was taking increasingly heavy fire as enemy fighters identified it as a strategic target. Concrete chips flew like deadly snowflakes each time bullets struck the walls, and Rachel found herself working in progressively more dangerous conditions. Private Martinez arrived at her aid station carried by 2 fellow soldiers, his face gray from blood loss after an IED had detonated near his position. The IED had driven metal fragments deep into his chest and abdomen, creating wounds that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent fatal bleeding. The radio brought increasingly urgent updates about the tactical situation. Enemy fighters had surrounded 3 sides of the village, effectively trapping the American forces in a deadly crossfire. Captain Hendricks made the decision to consolidate his forces in the village center, using the stone buildings for protection while they waited for close air support. Rachel was preparing to move Martinez to the new defensive position when the mortar round landed 15 feet from her aid station. The explosion was different than the others, closer, more violent, with a sound that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly into her chest. The force of the blast threw her backward against a concrete wall, and for several seconds the world dissolved into ringing silence and swirling dust. When her vision cleared, Rachel discovered that her left side was wet with something warm. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her uniform, originating from a jagged piece of metal that protruded from her lower abdomen. The shrapnel had penetrated deep enough to cause serious internal damage, but shallow enough that removing it might cause even more bleeding. The radio brought increasingly urgent updates about the tactical situation. Enemy fighters had surrounded 3 sides of the village, effectively trapping the American forces in a deadly crossfire. Captain Hendricks made the decision to consolidate his forces in the village center, using the stone buildings for protection while they waited for close air support. Rachel was preparing to move Martinez to the new defensive position when the mortar round landed 15 feet from her aid station. The explosion was different than the others, closer, more violent, with a sound that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly into her chest. The force of the blast threw her backward against a concrete wall, and for several seconds the world dissolved into ringing silence and swirling dust. When her vision cleared, Rachel discovered that her left side was wet with something warm. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her uniform, originating from a jagged piece of metal that protruded from her lower abdomen. The shrapnel had penetrated deep enough to cause serious internal damage, but shallow enough that removing it might cause even more bleeding. The irony was not lost on her. After treating dozens of similar wounds, she had become a casualty herself. But as she assessed her own injury with clinical detachment, Rachel realized that her situation was far more precarious than any of her previous patients. The evacuation helicopter was delayed indefinitely. Enemy fire had cut off most escape routes, and she was the only qualified medic available to treat the 6 wounded soldiers who depended on her expertise for survival. Private Martinez was still losing blood, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. Sergeant Williams had just been brought in with a severe head wound that required constant monitoring. The other casualties needed regular care to prevent their conditions from deteriorating. Rachel faced an impossible choice: seek treatment for her own potentially fatal wound, or continue working to keep her patients alive until evacuation became possible. She chose to keep working. The shrapnel felt like a red-hot poker embedded in her flesh, but Rachel forced herself to focus on Martinez, whose pulse was weakening under her fingertips. She had perhaps 10 minutes before his blood pressure dropped to critical levels, and the morphine she had administered was wearing off. Working through waves of pain that threatened to blur her vision, she inserted a chest tube to reinflate his collapsed lung, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. Blood was pooling beneath her own uniform, but she couldn't afford to examine the wound properly. Every second spent on self-treatment was a second stolen from soldiers who might die without immediate intervention. The tactical radio crackled with updates that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Enemy forces had moved rocket-propelled grenade launchers into the hills overlooking the village, making helicopter evacuation impossible until close air support could clear the area. Sergeant Williams arrived semi-conscious, carried by Corporal Davis, who had risked his life crossing 50 meters of open ground under sniper fire. The head wound was worse than Rachel had initially assessed over the radio. A bullet had grazed Williams' skull, creating a furrow that exposed brain tissue. She immediately began cleaning the wound and applying sterile dressings, knowing that infection could kill him even if he survived the immediate trauma. "Doc, you're bleeding pretty bad," Davis observed, noticing the expanding crimson stain on Rachel's uniform. "I'm fine," she lied, securing Williams' bandages with medical tape that seemed to slip from her increasingly clumsy fingers. The blood loss was beginning to affect her coordination, but she had treated enough hemorrhage cases to recognize her own symptoms. She estimated she had lost approximately 2 units of blood, serious but not immediately life-threatening if she could control the bleeding soon. The building shook as another mortar round struck nearby, and dust cascaded from the damaged ceiling. Through the smoke and debris, Rachel could see Captain Hendricks coordinating defensive positions from a doorway 20 meters away. His radio communications revealed the harsh mathematics of their situation: 6 wounded soldiers requiring constant medical attention, 1 combat medic who was now a casualty herself, and an estimated 40-minute wait before air support could suppress enough enemy fire to allow evacuation. Private Jackson was the next casualty to reach her position, his left leg mangled by an improvised explosive device that had detonated as he attempted to reach better cover. The blast had shattered his tibia and fibula, leaving bone fragments scattered through the surrounding tissue. Rachel began the painstaking process of cleaning and stabilizing the wound, working by feel as much as sight in the dim interior of the damaged building. Her own wound was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The shrapnel had penetrated deep enough to potentially damage internal organs, and she could feel warm blood trickling down her side with each movement. But Jackson's injuries require immediate attention. Without proper treatment, he could lose his leg or bleed out from severed blood vessels. She applied a tourniquet above the worst damage and began irrigating the wound with saline solution. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sound of approaching footsteps made Rachel reach for her sidearm, but she relaxed when Corporal Thompson appeared in the doorway, carrying medical supplies salvaged from a destroyed aid station elsewhere in the village. The additional morphine and bandages were desperately needed, but Thompson's report about the tactical situation was sobering. Enemy fighters had established positions that commanded most of the village's main routes, effectively creating a siege situation. "The captain wants to know your status, Doc," Thompson said, his eyes fixed on the blood soaking through Rachel's uniform. "He's asking if you can move the wounded to a more secure location." Rachel assessed her patients with growing concern. Martinez's breathing had stabilized, but he remained unconscious and required constant monitoring. Williams was awake but disoriented, showing signs of concussion that could worsen without proper neurological care. Jackson's leg wound had stopped bleeding, but he needed surgery within hours to prevent permanent disability. 3 other soldiers with less serious injuries were stable but unable to move without assistance. "Negative on relocation," she radioed to Captain Hendricks. "Multiple critical patients who can't be moved safely. We hold this position until evac arrives." What she didn't tell the captain was that her own condition was deteriorating faster than she had anticipated. The shrapnel wound was deeper than her initial assessment had suggested, and she was beginning to experience symptoms of internal bleeding, nausea, dizziness, and a rapid pulse that indicated her body was struggling to maintain blood pressure. She had perhaps 30 minutes before her own injuries would prevent her from treating other casualties. The decision crystallized with brutal clarity as she watched Martinez's vital signs fluctuate on her portable monitor. She could continue treating wounded soldiers until her own blood loss incapacitated her, potentially allowing multiple casualties to die when she collapsed. Or she could take 20 minutes to address her own injuries, gambling that she could keep herself functional long enough to save everyone. Rachel had never operated on herself under any circumstances, let alone in a combat zone, with enemy bullets striking the walls around her. But her medical training had included extensive anatomy studies, and she understood the principles of emergency surgery better than anyone else in the village. The alternative, watching soldiers die because their medic had become too weak to help them, was unacceptable. She gathered the necessary supplies: local anesthetic, surgical instruments, sutures, and sterile dressings. The portable surgical light would provide adequate illumination, and she could use a mirror to guide her movements. The biggest challenge would be maintaining sterile conditions while mortar rounds shook dust from the ceiling and rifle fire echoed through the narrow streets outside. Working with methodical precision despite the pain and blood loss, Rachel prepared her makeshift operating area. She positioned Martinez and the other critical patients where she could monitor them during the procedure, knowing that any complications in their conditions would force her to abandon her own surgery. The radio remained within reach, allowing her to coordinate with Captain Hendricks if the tactical situation changed. The first incision would be the most dangerous, a precise cut that would allow access to the shrapnel without causing additional damage to surrounding organs. Rachel had performed similar procedures dozens of times on other patients, but operating on herself required a level of mental compartmentalism she had never attempted. She would need to simultaneously function as surgeon, patient, and combat medic, while enemy forces continued their assault on the village. As she sterilized the surgical instruments, Rachel caught sight of her reflection in a piece of broken glass. Her face was pale from blood loss, and sweat mixed with dust created streaks across her forehead. But her hands remained steady, and her mind stayed focused on the task ahead. She had 18 minutes before Martinez would need his next dose of medication, and the other casualties required regular monitoring to prevent their conditions from deteriorating. The building shook again as another explosion echoed through the village. Through the damaged walls, she could hear the distinctive whine of incoming artillery, followed by the sharp crack of American return fire. The battle was intensifying, but Rachel blocked out everything except the surgical procedure she was about to attempt. She took a deep breath, raised the scalpel, and began to operate on herself. The first cut sent lightning through her nervous system, but Rachel's hands remained steady as she extended the incision through skin and subcutaneous tissue. The local anesthetic had numbed the surface layers, but deeper structures sent waves of agony that threatened to cloud her concentration. She breathed through gritted teeth, counting seconds between each deliberate movement of the scalpel. Working with a hand mirror positioned to reflect the surgical site, Rachel navigated the unfamiliar perspective of operating in reverse. Every instinct developed through years of medical training had to be consciously overridden as she compensated for the mirror image. The shrapnel had penetrated at an oblique angle, creating a wound track that passed dangerously close to her liver and small intestine. Martinez's monitor began beeping urgently, indicating a drop in blood pressure that demanded immediate attention. Rachel paused her self-surgery, blood streaming from her partially open abdomen, and rushed to increase his IV fluid rate and administer vasopressor medications. His pulse strengthened within minutes, but the interruption had cost her precious time and allowed more blood to leak from her own surgical wound. Corporal Thompson's voice crackled over the radio with an update that sent ice through her veins. "Doc, we've got incoming wounded from 3rd Platoon. Multiple casualties with severe trauma. ETA 3 minutes. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Half-completed surgery, blood-soaked surgical drapes, and 3 incoming casualties who would need immediate life-saving interventions. The mathematical reality was brutal. If she continued operating on herself, soldiers would die waiting for treatment. If she stopped now, she might bleed out before completing the procedure. The sound of boots on concrete announced the arrival of the new casualties. Staff Sergeant Coleman appeared first, carried by 2 soldiers who were struggling under his weight. An improvised explosive device had torn through his lower torso, creating wounds that made Rachel's injury seem minor by comparison. Behind him came Private Hayes, with multiple shrapnel wounds across his chest and arms, and Specialist Rivera, whose right hand had been nearly severed by flying debris. Rachel made an instantaneous decision that violated every principle of medical triage. She grabbed additional surgical clamps and quickly secured the bleeding vessels in her own abdomen, leaving the shrapnel in place for now. Then, she threw sterile drapes over her partially completed surgery and turned her attention to Coleman, whose injuries were immediately life-threatening. Working with blood from her own wound mixing with that of her patients, Rachel began emergency surgery on Coleman's massive abdominal trauma. The IED blast had damaged multiple organs, requiring rapid decision-making about which injuries to address first. She controlled the hemorrhage from his spleen, repaired a tear in his intestine, and stabilized his blood pressure while enemy mortars continued to shake the building around them. The surreal nature of her situation struck her as she sutured Coleman's abdominal wall. She was performing complex trauma surgery while her own surgical site remained open and bleeding. Every movement sent fresh pain through her torso, but adrenaline and professional focus kept her hands steady. Hayes and Rivera waited for treatment, their condition stable but requiring attention she couldn't yet provide. Captain Hendricks appeared in the doorway, his face grim with tactical updates. Air support is 5 minutes out, but we're taking heavy casualties trying to hold the perimeter. How soon can we move these men? Rachel glanced at her watch, calculating the brutal mathematics of battlefield medicine. Coleman needed at least 15 more minutes of surgery to stabilize his injuries. Martinez required constant monitoring and would need immediate surgical facilities once evacuated. The other casualties needed varying degrees of ongoing care, and she still had to complete her own operation or risk bleeding out during transport. "Give me 20 minutes," she told the captain, knowing it was an impossible timeline, but understanding that longer delays might cost more lives. As soon as Hendricks departed, Rachel returned to Hayes, whose chest wounds were beginning to show signs of internal bleeding. She inserted chest tubes to drain accumulated blood and reinflate his collapsed lung, working with increasing urgency as her own strength began to ebb. The blood loss from her incomplete surgery was taking its toll, creating moments of dizziness that forced her to pause and steady herself. Rivera's hand required immediate attention to prevent permanent disability. The blast had severed tendons and blood vessels while leaving the appendage hanging by strips of skin and muscle. Rachel began the delicate process of repairing the damaged structures, knowing that each minute of delay reduced the chances of successful reattachment. The sound of approaching aircraft brought hope and new dangers. American close air support was arriving to suppress enemy positions, but the increased combat activity meant more potential casualties. Through the damaged walls, Rachel could see tracer rounds streaking across the darkening sky as helicopter gunships engaged Taliban fighters in the surrounding hills. With Rivera's hand temporarily stabilized, Rachel faced the moment she had been dreading, returning to her own surgical procedure. The partial repair she had attempted earlier was holding, but blood continued to seep from the incomplete incision. The shrapnel remained embedded near vital organs, creating an ongoing risk of internal bleeding or organ perforation. Working entirely by mirror image, Rachel extended her original incision and began the careful process of isolating the metal fragment. The shrapnel had created a complex wound track, passing between loops of intestine and stopping just short of her hepatic artery. One wrong movement could cause catastrophic bleeding that would be impossible to control under these conditions. Coleman's vital signs remained stable, but Martinez was showing early signs of kidney dysfunction that indicated ongoing blood loss. Hayes needed his chest tubes monitored for proper drainage, and Rivera required pain medication to prevent shock from his hand injury. Rachel realized she was orchestrating a complex medical operation while simultaneously performing surgery on herself, a situation no medical textbook had ever addressed. The extraction of the shrapnel required infinite patience and precise movements. Rachel used surgical forceps to gently grasp the metal fragment, testing its position and evaluating the surrounding tissue for damage. The piece was larger than she had initially estimated, a jagged triangle of steel that had somehow avoided major blood vessels during its penetration. As she worked, enemy fire intensified around their position. The close air support had engaged Taliban fighters, but the increased combat activity brought new dangers. Stray bullets struck the building with increasing frequency, sending concrete chips flying through the makeshift operating room. Rachel continued her surgery despite the chaos, knowing that stopping now could prove fatal for both herself and her patients. The moment of extraction arrived as another mortar round shook the building. Rachel maintained steady pressure on the forceps, slowly withdrawing shrapnel as blood welled up from the damaged tissues. The metal came free cleanly, revealing a wound track that had missed her major organs by millimeters. She immediately applied pressure to control bleeding and began the process of closing the surgical site. Through the radio, she heard Captain Hendricks coordinating the evacuation. The helicopter landing zone was secure, and medical transport would arrive within minutes. Rachel had successfully extracted the shrapnel and was beginning to suture her own abdomen when the final challenge arrived. The evacuation helicopter's rotor wash sent debris swirling through the damaged building as Rachel placed her final sutures, securing the layers of muscle and fascia she had just repaired. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the blood loss and adrenaline that had sustained her through the past hour of impossible medicine. "Doc, we need to move now," Corporal Thompson shouted over the helicopter noise, but Rachel was already assessing which patients could be safely transported. Martinez had stabilized after her earlier interventions, though he remained unconscious and would need immediate surgical facilities at the main base. Coleman's massive abdominal repairs were holding, but the complexity of his injuries meant that any delay could prove fatal. The challenge was logistical as much as medical. The helicopter could accommodate 6 stretcher cases, but Rachel had 7 critically wounded patients who needed immediate evacuation. Someone would have to wait for the second aircraft, and that delay could mean the difference between life and death. She made rapid calculations based on injury severity, blood loss, and chances of survival during transport. Coleman, Martinez, Williams, Hayes, Rivera, and Jackson go on the first bird, she decided, marking each patient's forehead with their triage priority. Rodriguez can wait for the second helicopter. His shoulder wound is stable and he's maintaining good vitals. As the medical evaluation team rushed into the building with stretchers and additional medical personnel, Rachel felt a moment of disorientation. For the past 3 hours, she had been the sole medical authority in a crisis that tested every aspect of her training. Now, suddenly, she was surrounded by other medics and flight nurses who could share the overwhelming burden of keeping multiple patients alive. Staff Sergeant Patricia Wells, the senior flight medic, took one look at Rachel's blood-soaked uniform and pale complexion before demanding, "What's your status, Morrison? You look like you've been through hell." "Self-inflicted surgical repair," Rachel replied with dark humor, lifting her shirt to reveal the fresh sutures that closed her abdominal wound. "Shrapnel penetration, successfully extracted, no major organ damage detected. I'm ambulatory and functional." Wells stared at the surgical site with professional amazement. "You operated on yourself, under fire, while treating 7 other casualties?" Before Rachel could answer, the building shook with another explosion, this one closer than any previous blast. Through the damaged walls, they could see Taliban fighters attempting to overrun the American defensive positions. The evacuation was taking place under increasingly dangerous conditions, with enemy forces making desperate attempts to prevent the wounded from escaping. The process of loading patients onto stretchers required careful coordination to avoid aggravating their injuries. Coleman's abdominal wounds needed constant monitoring during transport, while Martinez's head injury made him vulnerable to changes in blood pressure that could occur during helicopter flight. Rachel moved between patients, providing last-minute medical adjustments and briefing the flight crew on each individual's specific needs. Private Hayes grabbed her wrist as she checked his chest tube drainage. "Doc, you saved my life, all of us. We're not going to forget this." Rachel squeezed his hand briefly, then continued her preparations. The sentiment was appreciated, but she remained focused on ensuring that every patient survived the next critical hours. The real test of her work would come in the advanced surgical facilities at Bagram Airfield, where teams of specialists would determine whether her battlefield medicine had been sufficient to preserve life and function. As the first group of casualties was loaded onto the helicopter, Rachel experienced an unexpected moment of doubt. She had made countless decisions under extreme pressure, performing procedures that pushed the boundaries of field medicine. But now, watching her patients disappear into the aircraft, she wondered whether she had done enough. Had Coleman's abdominal repair been adequate? Would Martinez recover from his head trauma? Could Rivera regain full use of his reconstructed hand? The helicopter lifted off in a storm of dust and debris, carrying 6 wounded soldiers toward advanced medical care. Rachel watched until the aircraft disappeared over the mountain ridgeline, then turned her attention to Rodriguez, who was waiting for the second evacuation flight. His shoulder wound remained stable, but she wanted to ensure that no complications had developed during the extended delay. Captain Hendricks approached as she was checking Rodriguez's bandages. The company commander looked exhausted after coordinating the defense of the village for nearly 4 hours, but his expression showed relief that the evacuation was proceeding successfully. "Morrison, I've been in combat for 2 tours, and I've never seen anything like what you did today," he said. "Command is going to want a full report on your actions. Operating on yourself while treating multiple critical casualties, that's going to make military medical history." Rachel felt uncomfortable with the attention her self-surgery was attracting. From her perspective, she had simply done what was necessary to keep soldiers alive. The fact that it required operating on herself was merely an unusual complication, not grounds for special recognition. "Sir, any medic would have done the same thing under these circumstances," she replied. "We don't leave wounded soldiers behind, and that includes making sure the medic stays functional enough to treat them." The second helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by 2 Apache gunships that provided close air support during the evacuation. Rodriguez was loaded without incident, and Rachel found herself facing an unexpected decision. The flight medic aboard the aircraft assumed she would be escorting with her patient, but Captain Hendricks still had soldiers in the field who might need medical attention. "Your call, Doc," the captain said. "You've earned a ride out of here, especially with that surgical site that needs proper follow-up. But we still have 2 hours before we extract from this village, and things could get interesting." Rachel looked at her reflection in the helicopter's window. The fresh sutures in her abdomen pulled slightly with each movement, reminding her that she was still recovering from major trauma. Her uniform was stained with blood from multiple patients, and exhaustion was beginning to replace the adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis. But she also knew that Bravo Company still faced potential combat as they completed their mission and withdrew from the village. If additional casualties occurred, the nearest medical support would be 30 minutes away by helicopter. Her presence could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers who are still in harm's way. "I will stay with the company," she decided. "Rodriguez doesn't need medical escort during transport, and my soldiers might still need me here." The flight medic shook his head in amazement. "You just performed surgery on yourself under enemy fire, and now you're volunteering to stay in a combat zone? Morrison, you're either the bravest medic I've ever met or completely insane." "Maybe both," Rachel replied with a tired smile, as the helicopter lifted off, carrying the last of her critical patients towards safety. The village fell quiet after the aircraft departed, with only the distant sound of gunfire echoing from the surrounding hills. The Taliban assault had been repelled, but enemy forces remained in the area, waiting for opportunities to engage the American forces. Rachel retrieved her medical supplies and established a new aid station in a more secure building, preparing for whatever challenges the next 2 hours might bring. As she organized her remaining equipment, Rachel reflected on the events of the day. She had treated 8 wounded soldiers under the most challenging conditions imaginable, performing procedures that stretched the boundaries of field medicine. The self-surgery had been necessary but unprecedented, requiring her to function simultaneously as patient and physician while enemy fire continued around her position. The physical toll was becoming apparent as her adrenaline levels normalized. The surgical site ached with each movement, and she could feel the deep fatigue that follows massive blood loss and extreme stress. But her patients were alive and en route to advanced medical care, and that knowledge made every sacrifice worthwhile. Corporal Thompson appeared at her aid station carrying a field radio and medical supplies salvaged from other positions. "Doc, the captain wants you to know that all evacuated casualties arrived safely at Bagram. The surgeons there said your field work was exceptional. They didn't need to redo any of your repairs." Rachel felt a wave of relief that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. The confirmation that her battlefield medicine had been adequate meant that 8 soldiers would survive injuries that might have been fatal under different circumstances. The self-surgery, the impossible multitasking, the decisions made under extreme pressure, all of it had achieved the only goal that mattered. "Any word on their long-term prognosis?" she asked. Thompson consulted his notes. "Martinez is awake and responsive. No permanent brain damage detected. Coleman is stable and expected to make a full recovery. All the others are doing well. The medical staff wants to know how you managed to perform such advanced trauma surgery under field conditions." As the afternoon wore on, Rachel continued to provide medical support for the company as they completed their mission in the village. She treated minor injuries, monitored soldiers for signs of heat exhaustion and dehydration, and prepared for the possibility of additional combat casualties. But the major crisis had passed, and the most critically wounded soldiers were now receiving the advanced care they needed to survive. The extraction from Khalat Bazaar proceeded without incident, with Bravo Company boarding helicopters for the return flight to Forward Operating Base Viper. As Rachel settled into her seat for the 20-minute flight, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full impact of the day's events. She had pushed the boundaries of combat medicine further than any medic in recent military history, proving that extraordinary circumstances could produce extraordinary medical achievements. But more importantly, she had fulfilled the fundamental promise that every combat medic makes to their soldiers. No matter the circumstances, no matter the personal cost, wounded soldiers would receive the medical care needed to survive. Today, that promise had required her to operate on herself while treating multiple casualties under enemy fire. It was, she reflected as the helicopter carried her toward base, exactly what she had signed up for when she became a combat medic. The medical evaluation at Forward Operating Base Viper revealed the full extent of what Rachel had accomplished during those crucial hours in Khalat Bazaar. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base's chief surgeon, examined the surgical site with growing amazement as she reviewed Rachel's field notes and the photographic documentation that had been taken during the evacuation. "The precision of this self-repair is remarkable," Dr. Chen observed, studying the suture patterns that closed Rachel's abdominal wound. "You managed to extract a piece of shrapnel that was positioned within millimeters of your hepatic artery. One wrong movement could have caused catastrophic bleeding." Rachel sat on the examination table wearing a hospital gown that felt strange after months of combat uniforms. The familiar environment of a proper medical facility seemed almost surreal after the chaos of battlefield medicine. Clean floors, sterile instruments, and adequate lighting created a sharp contrast to the blood-soaked aid station where she had performed surgery on herself just hours earlier. The trajectory analysis shows the fragment entered at a 40-degree angle, passed between loops of the small intestine, and stopped just short of your liver capsule, Dr. Chen continued, pointing to the CT scan images displayed on her computer screen. "Your surgical approach was textbook perfect, despite working entirely by mirror image under combat conditions." The implications of Rachel's actions were already reverberating through military medical channels. Within hours of her return to base, reports of the self-surgery had reached the Pentagon, where senior medical officers were requesting detailed documentation of the procedure she had performed. The combination of advanced trauma surgery and unprecedented self-treatment under enemy fire represented a new chapter in combat medicine. Colonel Michael Harrison, the base commander, arrived at the medical facility as Dr. Chen was completing her examination. A career infantry officer with 3 combat deployments, Harrison had seen exceptional acts of courage throughout his military service, but Rachel's actions in Khalat Bazaar represented something beyond normal battlefield heroism. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, I've reviewed the preliminary reports from Captain Hendricks and the medical evacuation team. What you accomplished today challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of battlefield medicine. I'm recommending you for the Silver Star, and the Medical Corps is requesting permission to document your procedures for training purposes." Rachel felt uncomfortable with the attention her actions were generating. From her perspective, she had simply done what was necessary to keep wounded soldiers alive. The fact that it required self-surgery was an unusual complication, not grounds for special recognition or military decorations. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she replied. "Any combat medic would have made the same decisions under those circumstances. We don't abandon wounded soldiers, and that includes making sure the medic remains functional." Dr. Chen interjected with clinical observations that contradicted Rachel's modest assessment. "Staff Sergeant, what you accomplished goes far beyond normal combat medicine. You performed complex abdominal surgery on yourself while simultaneously treating 7 critical casualties. The level of medical multitasking you demonstrated has never been documented in military medical literature." The debriefing process continued over the next several days as military investigators and medical researchers sought to understand every aspect of Rachel's actions. The timeline of events was reconstructed minute by minute, from the initial mortar attack through the final evacuation of wounded soldiers. Each medical decision was analyzed and evaluated by panels of experts who struggled to comprehend how one person had managed such complex trauma care under extreme conditions. Captain James Hendricks provided crucial testimony about the tactical situation during the battle. His detailed account described the intensity of enemy fire, the number of casualties requiring treatment, and the impossible decisions Rachel had faced throughout the engagement. The captain's report emphasized that without her continued medical intervention, several soldiers would have died waiting for evacuation. Morrison was operating in conditions that would challenge a full surgical team in a hospital environment, Hendricks told the investigating officers. She had multiple critical patients, limited supplies, enemy fire impacting her position, and her own serious injuries. What she accomplished borders on the miraculous. The medical teams at Bagram Airfield provided follow-up reports on all 8 casualties that Rachel had treated in the village. Martinez had made a complete recovery from his head trauma with no apparent neurological deficits. Coleman's complex abdominal repairs had healed perfectly, allowing him to return to full duty within 6 weeks. The other soldiers had similarly positive outcomes, with all returning to active service after their recovery periods. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief trauma surgeon at Bagram, submitted a detailed analysis of Rachel's field medicine that would later be published in the Journal of Military Medicine. Her assessment concluded that the quality of trauma care provided under such extreme conditions represented a new standard for battlefield medical intervention. The surgical techniques demonstrated by Staff Sergeant Morrison under combat conditions rival what we achieve in fully equipped operating rooms, Dr. Foster wrote. Her ability to perform life-saving procedures while managing her own traumatic injury represents an unprecedented achievement in military medicine. The psychological evaluation required after such extreme combat exposure revealed the mental resilience that had enabled Rachel to function under impossible pressure. Major Lisa Rodriguez, the base psychologist, conducted extensive interviews to assess Rachel's emotional state and identify any signs of post-traumatic stress that might require treatment. "Your ability to compartmentalize during the crisis shows remarkable psychological strength," Major Rodriguez observed during one of their sessions. "Most people would have been overwhelmed by the pain and stress of their own injury, but you maintained focus on treating other casualties for several hours." Rachel found the psychological evaluation more challenging than the medical examinations. Discussing the emotional aspects of her experience forced her to confront feelings she had suppressed during the crisis. The weight of responsibility for multiple lives, the physical pain of operating on herself, and the constant awareness that any mistake could prove fatal had created stress levels that most people could never comprehend. "I kept thinking about the soldiers who were depending on me," she explained to Major Rodriguez. "Martinez was unconscious and needed constant monitoring. Coleman's abdominal injuries could have killed him if I made the wrong decision. Hayes had chest tubes that required adjustment. I couldn't afford to think about my own pain when their lives were at stake." The psychological evaluation more challenging than the medical examinations. Discussing the emotional aspects of her experience forced her to confront feelings she had suppressed during the crisis. The weight of responsibility for multiple lives, the physical pain of operating on herself, and the constant awareness that any mistake could prove fatal had created stress levels that most people could never comprehend. "I kept thinking about the soldiers who were depending on me," she explained to Major Rodriguez. "Martinez was unconscious and needed constant monitoring. Coleman's abdominal injuries could have killed him if I made the wrong decision. Hayes had chest tubes that required adjustment. I couldn't afford to think about my own pain when their lives were at stake." The investigation also revealed the innovative medical techniques Rachel had developed during the crisis. Her method of using a mirror to guide self-surgery while monitoring multiple patients had never been attempted in any medical setting. The way she prioritized treatment based on rapidly changing tactical conditions demonstrated decision-making skills that challenged conventional triage protocols. Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, the regional medical officer, conducted extensive interviews with Rachel to document her decision-making process throughout the engagement. His goal was to identify principles that could be incorporated into combat medic training programs, potentially saving lives in future conflicts. "Walk me through your thought process when you decide to operate on yourself," Kim requested during one session. "What factors influence that decision, and how did you balance your own medical needs against those of your patients?" Rachel found it difficult to articulate the split-second calculations that had driven her actions during the crisis. The decisions had been based on years of medical training, combat experience, and an intuitive understanding of battlefield conditions that defied easy explanation. "The math was simple," she finally said. "If I didn't address my own bleeding, I would eventually become incapacitated and unable to treat the other casualties. But if I took too much time on self-surgery, patients with more critical injuries might die waiting for treatment. I had to find a way to do both simultaneously." The media attention surrounding Rachel's actions created unexpected challenges, as news organizations sought interviews and exclusive stories about the combat medic who had operated on herself under fire. The military's public affairs office worked to balance legitimate public interest with operational security concerns and Rachel's privacy preferences. Major General Patricia Williams, the commanding general for medical operations in Afghanistan, flew to Forward Operating Base Viper specifically to meet with Rachel and understand the implications of her actions for future military medicine. The general's visit highlighted the significance that senior leadership placed on the medical innovations demonstrated during the battle. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, your actions in Kalat Bazar have changed how we think about the capabilities of combat medics," General Williams said during their meeting. "The techniques you developed under extreme pressure are already being incorporated into advanced medical training programs." Rachel found it surreal that her desperate attempts to keep soldiers alive had become the subject of high-level military planning and medical education reform. The procedures she had performed out of necessity were being analyzed by teams of experts and transformed into formal training protocols for future combat medics. The award ceremony took place 6 weeks after the battle, with Rachel's family traveling from her hometown in Ohio to witness the presentation of the Silver Star. Her parents, both teachers who had worried constantly about her daughter's deployment to Afghanistan, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what she had accomplished under combat conditions. "We always knew Rachel was dedicated to helping people," her mother said during the ceremony, "but we never imagined she would go to such lengths to save the lives of fellow soldiers. We're proud of her courage and her commitment to military medicine." The citation accompanying the Silver Star detailed her actions in clinical language that somehow failed to capture the full drama of those crucial hours in the village. Words like exceptional courage and outstanding medical skill seemed inadequate to describe the reality of performing surgery on herself while treating multiple critical casualties under enemy fire. As Rachel stood at attention during the award presentation, she thought about the 8 soldiers whose lives had hung in the balance during that chaotic afternoon. Martinez had returned to duty and was preparing for promotion to sergeant. Coleman had been medically retired but was living normally with his family. The others had similarly positive outcomes, with all making complete or near-complete recoveries from their injuries. The true measure of her success was not the military decoration or the academic recognition, but the simple fact that every soldier she had treated in Kalat Bazar had survived to go home to their families. That achievement justified every moment of pain, difficult decision, and every boundary-pushing medical intervention she had performed under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Looking back on that day, Rachel realized that her actions had been driven by a fundamental principle that guides all military medical personnel: the absolute commitment to preserving life regardless of personal cost. The self-surgery had been unusual, but the motivation behind it was as old as military medicine itself: the promise that wounded soldiers would never be abandoned, no matter how desperate the circumstances became. 2 years after the battle at Kalat Bazar, Rachel Morrison found herself standing before an auditorium filled with medical students at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with doctors, nurses, and military medical personnel who had traveled from across the country to hear her speak about advanced trauma care under extreme conditions. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had once been uncomfortable with attention for her combat actions was now one of the most requested speakers in military medical education. Her techniques had been incorporated into the curriculum at every major military medical training facility, and her case study was required reading for combat medics deploying to active theaters. "The question I'm asked most frequently," Rachel began, addressing the audience with the same calm professionalism she had displayed in that damaged building in Afghanistan, "is whether I would make the same decision again, knowing what I know now about the risks involved in self-surgery under combat conditions." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief of trauma surgery at Walter Reed, had introduced Rachel by detailing the medical innovations that had emerged from her battlefield experiences. New training protocols, surgical techniques, and decision-making frameworks had all been developed based on her actions during those critical hours. The impact on military medicine had been profound and lasting. In the 2 years since Kalat Bazar, Rachel's career had taken unexpected directions. Promoted to Sergeant First Class, she had been assigned to the Army Medical Research Command, where she worked with teams of doctors and researchers to develop new approaches to battlefield trauma care. Her insights as someone who had actually performed extreme medicine under fire proved invaluable in designing realistic training scenarios. "The reality of combat medicine," Rachel continued her lecture, "is that textbook procedures often prove inadequate when you're dealing with multiple casualties, limited resources, and active enemy engagement. We have to prepare medicine for situations where conventional wisdom doesn't apply." The audience included several of the soldiers she had treated in Afghanistan. Private Martinez, now Sergeant Martinez, sat in the front row wearing dress blues and sporting the sergeant's stripes he had earned after returning to duty. His presence served as a living reminder of why Rachel's extraordinary actions had been necessary that day. Staff Sergeant Coleman had also attended, though his military career had ended due to the extent of his injuries. He now worked as a civilian contractor, training military medical personnel based on his experiences as a trauma patient. The collaboration between wounded soldiers and medical personnel had created new perspectives on battlefield care that were revolutionizing military medicine. Dr. Michael Stevens from Johns Hopkins University raised his hand during the question period. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, the psychological pressure of operating on yourself while treating multiple critical patients must have been enormous. How do we train medics to handle that level of stress without compromising your decision-making abilities?" Rachel considered the question carefully before responding. The psychological aspects of her experience had been as challenging as the medical procedures, and she had spent considerable time working with military psychologists to understand how extreme stress affected medical performance. "The key is realistic training that gradually increases stress levels while maintaining focus on patient care," she explained. "We've developed simulation exercises that replicate the chaos of combat while teaching medics to compartmentalize their own physical and emotional state. The goal is to make life-saving procedures so automatic that they can be performed even under extraordinary pressure." The simulation programs Rachel helped develop had become the gold standard for combat medical training. Using advanced technology and carefully designed scenarios, new medics experienced situations that closely replicated the conditions she had faced in Afghanistan. The training was intense and often overwhelming, but it prepared medical personnel for realities they might encounter in future conflicts. Captain Lisa Park from the Navy Medical Corps asked about the ethical considerations involved in self-treatment during combat operations. At what point does a medic's responsibility to treat others override their own medical needs? How do we establish guidelines for such extreme situations? The question touched on issues that military medical ethicists were still debating. Rachel's actions had forced a reconsideration of traditional medical ethics in combat environments, where normal rules about patient care and physician responsibility often proved inadequate. "Every situation is unique," Rachel replied, "but the fundamental principle remains constant. We do whatever is necessary to preserve the greatest number of lives. Sometimes that means a medic accepts higher personal risk to continue treating patients. The decision has to be made in real time based on the specific circumstances and available resources." After the formal presentation, Rachel met privately with a group of female soldiers who were preparing for deployment as combat medics. The military's recognition of women in combat roles had evolved significantly since her deployment, and she had become a role model for female medical personnel entering traditionally male-dominated fields. "The physical demands of combat medicine are significant," she told the group, "but the mental preparation is equally important. You need to develop confidence in your abilities and trust in your training. When lives are at stake, hesitation can be fatal." Specialist Amanda Foster, a newly graduated combat medic, asked about maintaining composure when treating severe trauma. "How do you stay focused when you're seeing injuries that most people couldn't even imagine? The training scenarios are intense, but I worry about how I'll react to real battlefield trauma." Rachel remembered her own early experiences with combat casualties and the gradual process of developing emotional resilience. The ability to function effectively while treating horrific injuries required a delicate balance between empathy and professional detachment that came only with experience. "You learn to focus on what you can control," she explained. "Instead of being overwhelmed by the severity of injuries, you concentrate on the specific procedures that can save lives. Your emotions become secondary to your medical responsibility, but you never lose sight of the human cost of combat." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics ranging from equipment limitations to leadership challenges in medical units. Rachel found these interactions with new medics particularly rewarding, knowing that her experiences could help prepare them for the realities of battlefield medicine. Later that evening, Rachel attended a reunion dinner with the soldiers from Bravo Company who had been present during the battle at Kalat Bazaar. The gathering had become an annual tradition, bringing together men who had shared one of the most intense combat experiences of their military careers. Captain Hendricks, now a major commanding his own company, raised a toast to commemorate the second anniversary of the battle. "To the medic who redefined what's possible under fire, and to the soldiers who came home because of her actions. What happened in that village changed all of our lives." The dinner conversation revealed how that single day had affected each soldier differently. Some had struggled with post-traumatic stress, while others had found new purpose in their military service. All of them, however, credited Rachel's medical intervention with giving them the opportunity to continue their lives and careers. Private Hayes, now a staff sergeant, shared his perspective on the long-term impact of his injuries. "The chest wounds I sustained required months of rehabilitation, but Dr. Morrison's field treatment made a complete recovery possible. I was able to re-enlist and continue serving, something that wouldn't have happened without her intervention." The medical community's interest in Rachel's case had extended far beyond military applications. Civilian trauma centers had begun incorporating her techniques into their emergency protocols, recognizing that the principles of extreme medicine could apply to natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and other mass casualty events. Dr. Robert Chen from Massachusetts General Hospital had visited Walter Reed specifically to study Rachel's methods. "The decision-making framework you developed under combat stress has applications in civilian emergency medicine," he told her during their meeting. "We're seeing improved outcomes in our trauma bay when we apply the rapid assessment and treatment prioritization techniques you pioneered." The research based on Rachel's experiences had resulted in peer-reviewed publications in prestigious medical journals. Her case study appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of Trauma Surgery, and Military Medicine, reaching audiences far beyond the military medical community. The academic recognition was gratifying, but Rachel remained most proud of the practical applications that were saving lives in real-world situations. Combat medics deploying to conflict zones carried equipment and training that had been developed directly from her battlefield innovations. The knowledge gained from her experience was protecting soldiers in ongoing operations around the world. As her current assignment at Walter Reed was drawing to a close, Rachel faced decisions about the next phase of her military career. She had been offered positions in medical research, advanced surgical training, and leadership roles within the military medical establishment. Each option represented an opportunity to continue influencing the field of combat medicine. "I've been thinking about returning to field operations," she confided to Dr. Walsh during one of their regular meetings. "The research and training work has been valuable, but I miss the direct patient care aspect of being a combat medic." Dr. Walsh understood the motivation, but expressed concern about the psychological pressure of returning to combat after such a traumatic experience. "You've already contributed more to military medicine than most people accomplish in their entire careers. Are you certain you want to risk another deployment to an active theater?" Rachel had considered the question extensively during her time at Walter Reed. The comfortable environment of military medical research was professionally satisfying, but she felt drawn back to the challenging work of battlefield medicine. Her experiences had given her unique skills and perspectives that could benefit soldiers in future conflicts. Combat medics save lives by being present when soldiers need medical care. All the research and training in the world doesn't replace having experienced medical personnel available during combat operations. If I can continue making a difference in the field, that's where I belong. The decision to return to operational deployment represented more than a career choice. It was a commitment to the fundamental principles that had driven her actions in Kalat Bazar. Despite having achieved recognition and career advancement that could have led to permanent assignment in comfortable positions, Rachel remained focused on the core mission of military medicine. 6 months later, Sergeant First Class Rachel Morrison deployed to Syria as the senior medical NCO for a special operations unit conducting counterterrorism missions. Her reputation had preceded her, and the soldiers under her medical care knew they were working with someone who had redefined the possibilities of battlefield medicine. The deployment brought new challenges and different types of combat injuries, but Rachel approached each situation with the same methodical professionalism that had served her well in Afghanistan. Her experience had taught her that every medical emergency was unique, requiring rapid assessment and creative solutions based on available resources and tactical constraints. Standing in a forward aid station near the Iraqi border, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small town in Ohio to the forefront of military medical innovation. The self-surgery in Afghanistan had been just one moment in a career dedicated to preserving life under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The soldiers she now treated carried equipment and training that had been developed from her battlefield innovations. The techniques she had pioneered under extreme stress had become standard procedures taught to combat medics around the world. Most importantly, the principles she had demonstrated, that medical personnel never abandon their patients regardless of personal cost, continue to guide military medicine in conflicts across the globe. As she prepared her medical equipment for another day of operations, Rachel understood that her greatest achievement wasn't the recognition or the awards, but the knowledge that her actions had established new standards for what was possible in combat medicine. Every life saved using techniques developed from her experience validated the sacrifices made during those crucial hours in a damaged building in Afghanistan. The legacy of Kalat Bazar lived on in every combat medic who refused to accept the limitations of conventional medicine when soldiers' lives hung in the balance. The radio crackled with urgent voices as Rachel Morrison sprinted across the Syrian compound, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each step. 3 years had passed since Kalat Bazar, but the familiar rush of adrenaline felt identical as she responded to reports of multiple casualties from an improvised explosive device that had detonated during a routine patrol. "Two critical, 3 walking wounded," came the report from Staff Sergeant Bradley Chen, the team leader whose voice carried the controlled tension of someone managing a crisis. "IED took out the lead vehicle. We need immediate medical intervention." Rachel reached the blast site within 90 seconds, her trained eyes automatically assessing the scene while her hands were already reaching for the medical supplies she would need. The explosion had been more sophisticated than typical roadside bombs, suggesting the involvement of experienced bomb makers who understand how to maximize casualties among American forces. Corporal David Williams lay unconscious 20 feet from the destroyed vehicle, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle that indicated multiple fractures. Blood pooled beneath his torso, suggesting internal injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention. Next to him, Private Jennifer Lopez was conscious but showing signs of severe shock, her face pale and her breathing rapid and shallow. "Lopez, can you hear me?" Rachel asked while beginning her assessment of Williams' injuries. The corporal's pulse was weak but steady, and his airway remained clear despite the blood trickling from his mouth. The leg fracture was obvious, but she was more concerned about potential internal bleeding that could prove fatal within minutes. "Doc, my chest feels like it's on fire," Lopez responded through gritted teeth. Rachel could see the telltale signs of blast lung injury, the invisible trauma that occurred when explosive pressure waves damaged delicate lung tissue. It was a condition that could deteriorate rapidly without proper treatment. Working with the efficiency developed through years of combat medicine, Rachel established IV access on both critical patients while simultaneously directing the treatment of the walking wounded. Sergeant Martinez had sustained shrapnel wounds to his arms and face that required cleaning and bandaging, while specialists Rodriguez and Taylor were suffering from concussion symptoms that needed careful monitoring. The tactical situation complicated the medical emergency as enemy fighters began engaging the American position from concealed locations in the surrounding buildings. What had begun as a medical evacuation was rapidly evolving into a firefight that would make treating the wounded significantly more dangerous. "We've got shooters in the apartment complex to the east," reported Sergeant Chen over the radio. "Multiple muzzle flashes, possibly 5 or 6 fighters with automatic weapons. The medical team needs to stay low." Rachel continued working on Williams while bullets snapped overhead, her body instinctively hunching to present a smaller target, while her hands maintained the steady pressure needed to control his bleeding. The parallel to her experience in Afghanistan was unmistakable. Once again, she was providing life-saving medical care while under direct enemy fire. The complexity of Williams' injuries became apparent as she completed her initial assessment. The IED blast had caused massive trauma to his left leg, requiring immediate amputation to prevent fatal blood loss. But more critically, she suspected damage to his spleen that was causing internal bleeding faster than she could replace lost fluids through IV therapy. "I need to get Williams to a surgical facility immediately," she radioed to the Tactical Operations Center. "He's got internal bleeding that's beyond my field capabilities. How soon can we get a medevac helicopter?" The response was not encouraging. Enemy anti-aircraft fire had been reported in the area, making helicopter operations extremely dangerous. The nearest surgical facility was 40 minutes away, but the route passed through territory where additional IED attacks were likely. Lopez's condition was deteriorating as blast lung injury began affecting her ability to maintain adequate oxygen levels in her blood. Rachel connected her to a portable ventilator while preparing emergency medications that might stabilize her breathing until evacuation became possible. The decision-making process felt familiar yet different from her experience in Afghanistan. She still faced impossible choices about resource allocation and treatment priorities, but 3 years of additional experience had refined her judgment about what was medically feasible under extreme conditions. Working methodically through her treatment protocols, Rachel stabilized Williams' leg fracture with an improvised splint while maintaining pressure on his abdominal wounds. The bleeding was controlled but not stopped, meaning that every minute of delay brought him closer to irreversible shock. "Contact left! Contact left!" The shout came from Corporal Thompson, who was providing security for the medical team while Rachel worked on the casualties. Enemy fighters had moved closer to the American position, using the urban environment to mask their approach until they could engage at close range. The intensity of gunfire increased dramatically as both sides engaged in a firefight that transformed the street into a lethal corridor of flying bullets and ricocheting debris. Rachel found herself treating critical patients in the middle of an active combat zone, with enemy rounds impacting close enough to send concrete fragments raining down on her work area. "Doc, we need to move these casualties now," urged Sergeant Chen, who was coordinating the tactical response while trying to protect the medical team. Rachel faced the same type of crisis that had defined her actions in Afghanistan: the need to balance medical requirements against tactical realities. Moving Williams before his bleeding was adequately controlled could prove fatal, but remaining in place might expose all the casualties to greater danger. "Give me 5 more minutes," she responded, making rapid calculations about what was medically essential versus what would be ideal. Williams needed emergency surgery that she couldn't provide in the field, but she could potentially stabilize him enough to survive transport to definitive medical care. Working with desperate efficiency, Rachel used techniques she had developed in Afghanistan to control Williams' internal bleeding using pressure points and pharmaceutical interventions that might buy enough time for evacuation. The procedures were experimental and risky, but conventional field medicine offered no solutions for his critical condition. Lopez's breathing stabilized as the ventilator compensated for her damaged lung tissue, but she remained critically dependent on mechanical support that would be difficult to maintain during transport. The evacuation began 20 minutes after the initial blast, with Rachel and her patients loaded into armored vehicles that would transport them to the nearest forward operating base. The convoy faced the constant threat of additional IEDs while racing against the medical timeline that determined whether Williams would survive his injuries. During the 40-minute journey, Rachel continued providing intensive medical care while the vehicle bounced over rough roads and swerved to avoid potential threats. She monitored Williams' vital signs, adjusted Lopez's ventilator settings, and maintained communication with the receiving medical facility about the incoming casualties. "Trauma Team Alpha, this is Morrison with 2 criticals inbound. Williams has massive internal bleeding, possible splenic rupture, compound leg fracture. Lopez has severe blast lung injury, currently on mechanical ventilation. ETA is 3 minutes. The handoff to the surgical team represented a moment Rachel had experienced hundreds of times throughout her career. The transition from field medicine to definitive hospital care that determined whether her battlefield interventions had been sufficient to preserve life. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the trauma surgeon who received Williams, later reported that Rachel's field treatment had been the determining factor in his survival. The pressure techniques she used to control internal bleeding bought us exactly the time we needed for emergency surgery. Another 10 minutes of delay and we would have lost him. Lopez recovered completely from her blast lung injuries and returned to duty 6 weeks later. The other casualties had similarly positive outcomes, with all returning to active service after their recovery periods. Once again, Rachel's medical interventions under extreme conditions had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost. The incident in Syria became another case study in combat medicine, but Rachel found herself less interested in the academic recognition than in the practical lessons that could be applied to future operations. Each combat medical emergency taught her something new about the possibilities and limitations of battlefield medicine. Standing in the medical facility that evening, Rachel reflected on how her approach to combat medicine had evolved since Afghanistan. The fundamental principles remained unchanged. Preserve life regardless of personal cost. Adapt procedures to available resources, and never abandon wounded soldiers. But her understanding of how to apply those principles had been refined through years of experience and continued education. The military medical community continued to study her methods, incorporating new insights into training programs and operational procedures. But Rachel understood that the real measure of success wasn't academic publication or professional recognition. It was the simple fact that soldiers continued to come home alive because of improved battlefield medical care. Captain Maria Santos, the base medical officer, approached Rachel as she was completing her post-incident reports. Morrison, your actions today exemplify everything we're trying to teach new combat medics. You saved 2 lives that would have been lost under conventional field medicine protocols. Rachel appreciated the recognition but remained focused on the ongoing challenges of military medicine. Each deployment brought new types of injuries, different tactical situations, and evolving threats that required constant adaptation of medical procedures. The work was never finished, and complacency could prove fatal for future casualties. "The techniques work because we've had time to develop and refine them," Rachel replied. "But every situation is unique. The key is training medics to think creatively and adapt to circumstances they've never encountered before." As her deployment in Syria neared its end, Rachel began considering her next assignment within the military medical system. She had been offered positions in research, education, and operational leadership that would allow her to continue influencing the development of combat medicine. Each option represented different ways of contributing to the mission of saving lives in military operations. The choice ultimately came down to where she could have the greatest impact on preserving soldiers' lives. Research and education were valuable, but Rachel remained convinced that experienced medics needed to continue serving in operational roles where their expertise could directly benefit wounded personnel. "I'm requesting an assignment to the Special Operations Medical Training Center," she told Captain Santos during their final meeting. "I want to train the next generation of combat medics who will deploy to active theaters. If we can improve their skills and decision-making abilities, we'll save more lives in future conflicts." The assignment represented a natural evolution of Rachel's career, from operational medic to educator and leader. Her experiences in Afghanistan and Syria had given her unique insights into the realities of battlefield medicine that could only be gained through direct combat exposure. 6 months later, Master Sergeant Rachel Morrison stood before a class of newly graduated combat medics at Fort Sam Houston, preparing them for deployment to ongoing military operations around the world. The students represented the future of military medicine, and their training would determine how effectively the military could preserve life under combat conditions. "Combat medicine isn't about memorizing procedures or following checklists," she told the class during her opening lecture. "It's about developing the judgment and adaptability to save lives when everything goes wrong. Your patience will depend on your ability to think creatively and act decisively under the worst possible circumstances." The training program Rachel developed incorporated realistic scenarios based on her combat experiences, preparing medics for the psychological and technical challenges they would face in operational environments. Students learned not just medical procedures, but the mental resilience needed to function effectively when lives hung in the balance. The legacy of Khalid Bazar lived on in every medic who graduated from Rachel's program. The principles she had demonstrated during those crucial hours in Afghanistan, that medical personnel adapt to any circumstance to preserve life, became the foundation for a new generation of military medical professionals. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reminded her of her own early days as a combat medic, Rachel understood that her greatest contribution to military medicine wasn't the self-surgery that had made her famous. It was the ongoing commitment to ensuring that future medics possessed the skills, judgment, and dedication needed to save lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The students before her would face their own moments of crisis, their own impossible decisions about how to preserve life when resources were limited and danger was immediate. But they would face those challenges with training and inspiration drawn from someone who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in combat medicine. Rachel Morrison had started her career as a small-town girl who wanted to help people. She had become a master sergeant whose innovations had transformed military medicine and whose example continues to inspire new generations of combat medics. The journey from Khalid Bazar to the training center represented not just personal achievement, but the evolution of military medicine. As she began her lecture on advanced trauma care, Rachel knew that her most important work lay ahead, preparing others to save lives with the same dedication and creativity that had defined her own career in military medicine. The months that followed brought Rachel face to face with the bureaucratic challenges of transforming combat experience into institutional knowledge.
Military medical doctrine moved slowly, constrained by regulations and procedures that often lagged years behind battlefield realities. Rachel found herself navigating complex approval processes to implement training programs based on her hard-won experience.
Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the commandant of the Medical Training Center, became both an ally and occasional obstacle as Rachel pushed for reforms that challenged traditional approaches to combat medicine education. The colonel appreciated Rachel's expertise, but worried about departing too dramatically from established protocols. Your field innovations are impressive, Morrison, but we need to ensure that new procedures meet safety standards and can be reliably taught to large numbers of students, Colonel Hawkins explained during one of their weekly meetings. What works for an exceptional medic like yourself might not be appropriate for average personnel. Rachel understood the concern, but remained convinced that combat medics needed training that prepared them for extraordinary circumstances rather than routine situations. Her experience had shown that battlefield medicine required personnel capable of adapting standard protocols to unique and dangerous conditions. "Ma'am, the problem with average training is that it produces average results," Rachel responded. "In combat, average medical care means soldiers who could have been saved. We need to raise the standard of what we consider normal performance under pressure." The debate reflected broader tensions within military medicine about how aggressively to pursue innovations that pushed the boundaries of established practice. Rachel's case had become a symbol for those advocating more adventurous approaches to combat medical training, while critics worried about encouraging dangerous improvisation among less experienced personnel. Dr. Kevin Walsh from the Army Medical Research Command visited the training center specifically to observe Rachel's teaching methods and assess their suitability for broader implementation. His evaluation would influence whether her techniques became standard curriculum or remained specialized training for elite units. "What I'm seeing here challenges conventional medical education in productive ways," Dr. Walsh observed after spending a week with Rachel's students. "The emphasis on creative problem-solving and adaptation to extreme circumstances produces medics who are genuinely prepared for combat realities." The validation from senior medical officers provided Rachel with institutional support for expanding her training programs. Within 6 months, elements of her curriculum were being adopted at medical training facilities across the military, reaching thousands of medics who would deploy to active combat zones. The ripple effects of Rachel's innovations extended beyond American military medicine. Allied nations requested access to her training materials, and NATO medical officers attended specialized courses at Fort Sam Houston to learn techniques developed from her combat experience. The international interest highlighted how her actions in Afghanistan had influenced military medicine on a global scale. During a joint training exercise with British Special Forces medics, Rachel worked alongside Sergeant Major Ian Mackenzie, a veteran of conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan who brought his own perspective to advanced combat medicine. The collaboration between experienced medics from different military traditions produced insights that neither could have developed independently. "Your approach to self-treatment under fire has applications we hadn't considered," Mackenzie told Rachel during a break in the training. "We've been developing protocols for medics operating alone in hostile territory, and your experience provides crucial guidance for those situations." The conversation led to joint research projects that examined how medical personnel could maintain effectiveness when separated from normal support systems. Rachel's experience of operating on herself while treating multiple patients had demonstrated possibilities that military medical planners were still exploring. Her influence on military medical equipment also grew as manufacturers sought her input on developing gear specifically designed for extreme combat conditions. Companies producing medical supplies recognized that Rachel's field experience could guide innovations that would save lives in future conflicts. "Traditional medical equipment assumes controlled environments that don't exist in combat," Rachel explained to engineers at a major medical device company. "We need instruments and supplies designed specifically for use under fire, with limited lighting, and by personnel who might be treating their own injuries simultaneously."
The collaboration resulted in new generations of medical equipment optimized for battlefield use. Portable surgical instruments, improved trauma dressings, and compact monitoring devices all incorporated lessons learned from Rachel's experience treating casualties under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Recognition of Rachel's contributions continued to expand as her methods proved successful in diverse combat environments. The Medal of Honor Society invited her to speak at their annual convention, where she addressed an audience of America's most decorated military personnel about the evolution of battlefield medicine. What Staff Sergeant Morrison accomplished represents the best traditions of military service, said Medal of Honor recipient Colonel James Murphy during his introduction. Her willingness to sacrifice personal safety to preserve the lives of fellow soldiers exemplifies the warrior ethos that defines our armed forces. The speaking engagement brought Rachel into contact with veterans from multiple generations of American conflicts, each offering perspectives on how combat medicine had evolved throughout military history. She found herself part of a continuum of medical innovation that stretched from Civil War battlefield surgeons to modern trauma specialists. Vietnam War veteran Dr. Michael Chen shared stories of medical improvisation during that conflict that paralleled many of Rachel's experiences. We learned that battlefield medicine requires personnel who can think beyond their formal training, he told her. Your experience in Afghanistan continues that tradition of medical innovation under extreme pressure. The historical perspective helped Rachel understand how her actions fit into broader patterns of military medical development. Each major conflict had produced innovations that improved care for future casualties, and her contributions represented the latest chapter in that ongoing evolution. As Rachel's second year at the training center progressed, she began developing advanced courses for senior medical personnel who would lead medical teams in combat operations. The curriculum addressed not only clinical skills but also the leadership challenges of managing medical resources under extreme stress. Chief Warrant Officer Carlos Rivera, a veteran medic with 3 combat deployments, enrolled in Rachel's advanced course to prepare for assignment as a senior medical advisor to special operations units. His experience provided valuable feedback about how Rachel's techniques applied to different types of combat operations.
The decision-making framework you teach is applicable across the spectrum of military medical operations, Rivera observed during one training session. Whether we're dealing with mass casualties from IED attacks or isolated injuries during reconnaissance missions, the principles of rapid assessment and creative problem-solving remain constant. The validation from experienced medical personnel confirmed that Rachel's innovations had broad applicability beyond the specific circumstances of her experience in Afghanistan. Her techniques were being successfully adapted to urban warfare, counterinsurgency operations, and conventional military engagements around the world. Research studies began documenting the measurable impact of Rachel's training methods on student performance and patient outcomes. Medical personnel who had completed her programs showed improved decision-making under stress, better patient survival rates, and greater adaptability to unexpected medical emergencies. Dr. Sarah Kim from the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center published findings that quantified the effectiveness of Rachel's approach. Students trained in advanced adaptation techniques showed 30% better performance in simulated combat medical scenarios compared to those receiving conventional training, her study concluded. The empirical evidence provided additional support for expanding Rachel's programs and incorporating her methods into standard military medical education. What had begun as one medic's response to an extreme situation was becoming a systematic approach to preparing medical personnel for combat operations. International recognition of Rachel's contributions culminated in an invitation to address the World Congress of Military Medicine in Geneva, Switzerland. The gathering brought together military medical personnel from over 50 nations to share innovations and coordinate approaches to battlefield medicine. The case of Staff Sergeant Morrison demonstrates how individual excellence under extreme circumstances can transform entire fields of medical practice, said Dr. François Dubois, the Congress president, in his introduction. Her experience provides lessons that transcend national boundaries and military traditions. Rachel's presentation to the international audience focused on the universal principles that had guided her actions rather than the specific details of her self-surgery. She emphasized the importance of training medical personnel to adapt standard procedures to unique circumstances and to maintain focus on patient care regardless of personal danger. The response from international colleagues revealed how her experience had influenced military medicine globally. Medical officers from countries as diverse as Australia, Germany, and Israel described how they had incorporated elements of her techniques into their own training programs. The psychological resilience required for extreme combat medicine is something we've struggled to teach effectively, said Colonel Hans Müller from the German Armed Forces Medical Service. Your experience provides a framework for developing that mental toughness in our own personnel. The international dialogue highlighted how combat medicine faced similar challenges across different military traditions and operational environments. Rachel's innovations had provided solutions that were being adapted and refined by medical professionals worldwide, creating a global community focused on improving battlefield medical care. As Rachel prepared to transition from the training center to her next assignment, she reflected on how her career had evolved from individual medical practice to institutional leadership. The young medic who had enlisted to help people had become a master sergeant whose influence extended throughout the global military medical community. Her final lecture at Fort Sam Houston drew an audience that included not only current students, but also graduates of her programs who had returned from combat deployments. The gathering represented a community of medical personnel united by shared commitment to the principles Rachel had demonstrated in Afghanistan. Your mission as combat medics extends beyond the specific patients you treat, Rachel told the assembled audience. Every life you save, every technique you develop, every example you set contributes to the ongoing evolution of medical medicine. You carry forward a tradition of innovation and dedication that will inspire future generations. The ceremony concluding Rachel's assignment featured presentations from students, colleagues, and senior officers who had been influenced by her work. But the most meaningful recognition came from soldiers whose lives had been saved by medics trained in her methods, living proof that her innovations continued to preserve life in combat operations around the world. Standing before her final class, Rachel understood that her legacy would be measured not by personal recognition, but by the continued effectiveness of the medical personnel she had trained and inspired. Her experience in Afghanistan had begun a transformation of military medicine that would outlast her own career and save countless lives in future conflicts. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.